Lena, Ethan, and Marcus weren't afraid of the unknown. In fact, they sought it out. The thrill of adventure was what brought them together, a bond formed in the heart of nature's most dangerous corners. Today, they found themselves standing at the edge of the Appalachian Mountains, staring down the narrow, overgrown trail known only to a few as the Lost Path. The trail wasn't on any modern map. The locals in the nearby town spoke of it in hushed tones, their eyes flicking nervously when asked. A place where hikers had disappeared without a trace. Strange whispers about shadows in the trees, and a strange presence that made the hairs on your neck stand up. Lena had heard the stories. Ethan had heard them too. But both were firm believers in logic over superstition. They weren't the types to fall prey to wild tales about ghosts or curses. They came for the adventure, the challenge, and the chance to prove themselves against the wilderness. Marcus, however, wasn't so sure. He had a different energy, a kind of cautious thrill-seeker who respected the boundaries of nature. But even he shrugged off the warnings as nothing more than local folklore. Still, as they packed their bags and laced up their boots, there was a subtle tension in the air, something unspoken, like a fog waiting to descend.
"Don't listen to the locals,"
Ethan said, breaking the silence as they stepped onto the trail, the thick trees immediately swallowing them whole.
"They're just scared of something they don't understand."
Lena, ever the optimist, laughed.
Exactly, it's all just stories to them. We'll prove it wrong.
But as they trekked deeper into the forest, something strange began to happen. The woods seemed unnaturally still. There were no birds chirping, no insects buzzing, just the quiet hum of the wind, which seemed to swirl and bend in unnatural directions. The leaves on the trees rustled faintly, as though the trees themselves were whispering secrets to each other. The deeper they went, the heavier the silence grew, until it felt like the forest was holding its breath.
Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?
Marcus asked, his voice low. He sounded almost embarrassed to admit it, but his eyes were scanning the shadows of the trees. Lena looked around. At first, she dismissed the feeling as a trick of the mind, the natural paranoia that came with being out in the wilderness. But as the minutes passed, she couldn't shake the sensation. The forest was too quiet, too still. Something was off. Ethan grinned, clearly unaffected.
"Come on, it's just the isolation. You're used to city noise, Marcus. The wilderness is different."
But even he couldn't deny the growing tension in the air. He adjusted his pack, pulling his jacket tighter around him. They had been walking for hours, and the mountain trail was proving to be more difficult than they had anticipated. The fog, which had seemed harmless at first, was beginning to roll in. It came in thick waves, obscuring their vision and distorting the landscape around them. The trees, once clear and imposing, now seemed like faint silhouettes emerging from a cloud of mist.
It's just the weather,
Lena said, trying to convince herself as much as the others.
Let's just keep moving. We'll find a good place to camp before dark.
But Marcus was already eyeing the horizon nervously.
Hey, this isn't the kind of place you want to get caught in after nightfall. We need to be careful.
They pushed on for a few more miles until the path grew steeper and narrower. The forest around them became denser, the trees growing taller and closer together. It felt like the mountain was swallowing them whole. But the strangest part was the fog. It wasn't just surrounding them. It was moving, shifting, as if alive. By the time they reached a small clearing to set up camp, the sky had already darkened. The air was cold, and the only sounds were their own footsteps and the crackling of the fire as they built it. But as the flame flickered, a chill crept in that wasn't just the temperature. There was something about the way the firelight danced, casting long, wavering shadows that made the trees seem to bend and sway in unnatural ways. Something about the silence in the forest, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig, felt wrong. The deeper the night grew, the more oppressive the air became. Lena forced a smile, trying to shake the unease in her chest. "See, it's not so bad," she said, looking at Ethan and Marcus as they unpacked their gear. but her voice sounded hollow, even to her own ears. Ethan, ever the optimist, nodded but said nothing. He could feel it, too, now. That strange pull. A pressure in the air. Something wasn't right.
I'll take the first watch.
Marcus offered, breaking the silence.
You guys get some rest.
But as they settled into their sleeping bags, the wind picked up. It howled through the trees, rattling the branches above them, but there was something unnatural about the sound. It wasn't the usual whistle of mountain winds. It was sharp, almost like whispers. And then it came, so soft, so faint, that at first they thought it was just the wind. But then it came again, a voice, a whisper, so low it was almost a murmur. It didn't sound like a breeze at all. It sounded like someone, or something, calling out to them. Lena's eyes snapped open.
Did you hear that?
She whispered, her breath shallow. Ethan sat up, his heart pounding in his chest.
What is that? Who's out there?
But there was no answer, just the faint rustling of leaves, the distant crackle of the fire, and that unsettling whisper that grew louder, as if something in the forest was speaking to them. The fire crackled faintly in the distance as Lena, Ethan, and Marcus trekked deeper into the heart of the Appalachian wilderness. They had hoped for a challenge, for a pure connection with nature, but the deeper they went, the more they began to sense that something was wrong. The forest, once alive with the vibrant chorus of birds and insects, now seemed eerily quiet. The rustling of leaves underfoot was their only company. With each step, the trail became harder to follow. The path wound through tangled underbrush, weaving between trees that towered over them like ancient guardians. Lena glanced around, trying to shake the creeping unease that had settled in her chest. The atmosphere was thick, suffocating even. The air felt heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath.
Does anyone else feel like the world's gone deal?
Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darted nervously between the trees, as though expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Lena gave a nervous laugh, trying to reassure herself more than him.
It's just the wilderness, Marcus. Nature's like this sometimes. It's unpredictable.
But even as she spoke, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling deep inside her gut. The birds, which had once flitted from tree to tree, now seemed absent, leaving only the hollow silence of the forest. The wind had died down completely, and the temperature was beginning to drop. It wasn't the kind of cold that comes with the night. It was an unnatural chill, one that seemed to seep into their bones. Ethan, who had been walking ahead, stopped suddenly. He wiped his brow and looked around, his expression clouded with unease.
It's getting colder. I don't like this. We should keep moving.
Maybe we should stop for a break.
Lena suggested, her breath visible in the air now.
Rest for a bit. We've been pushing pretty hard.
They came to a small ridge that overlooked a valley below, the fog now creeping in thicker than before. The view, once stunning and serene, now seemed oppressive. The mountains, towering and jagged, were shrouded in mist, as if the earth itself was closing in around them. As they sat down, unpacking a few snacks and water bottles, the sky, which had been clear only moments ago, suddenly darkened. The clouds rolled in quickly, casting long shadows across the ridge. The wind, which had been dead quiet, picked up suddenly, howling through the trees with a shrill, eerie tone. It felt as if the very landscape was turning against them. Lena pulled her jacket tighter, her eyes scanning the horizon.
What the hell? It wasn't supposed to rain today.
Marcus stood up abruptly, his face pale.
Oh, we should get off this ridge. It's too exposed out here.
The three of them began to pack up, but as they did, a strange sensation swept over them. The temperature dropped even further, the chill biting into their skin. It wasn't just cold, it felt like something watching. The kind of sensation you get when you're being followed, but you can't see anyone. Ah! Suddenly the mist below them swirled violently, rising like a tidal wave, obscuring the ground beneath them. The trees, once steady in their shadows, now seemed to sway unnaturally, their branches twisting in ways that didn't make sense. Something about the movement of the fog felt wrong.
Let's move.
Ethan urged, his voice tight with panic now.
We've got to get out of here. This place is messing with us.
The three of them began to move, their steps quickening as they made their way back down the ridge, but it was as though the mountain itself was pushing them back. The mist thickened, swallowing the trail in front of them. The trees on either side of the path seemed to close in, blocking their way as though the forest was conspiring to keep them from leaving. Then it came. A low sound, barely audible at first, a whisper.
Did you hear that?
Lena's voice trembled as she looked around, her heart pounding in her chest. Marcus froze, his face draining of color.
It's coming from the trees.
The whispering grew louder, an indistinct murmur like voices on the wind. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from. But what chilled them to the bone was that the voices seemed to be calling their names, soft at first, but growing more urgent. Lena, Marcus, Ethan. The words were faint, but unmistakable. Lena's stomach dropped. The sound wasn't natural. It was human, but not quite. It was like the wind had taken on a life of its own, shaping itself into words. But it wasn't just any wind. It was the forest itself, speaking in a language that made no sense. "Let's go!" Ethan shouted, panic overtaking him. "Now!" They turned and ran, stumbling through the mist, the path now completely invisible. The world around them was a blur of shadows and whispers, their own breath ragged in the cold air. The trees seemed to loom closer, as if they were being pushed back into the heart of the mountain, trapped by the dense fog. Light buzzed by him, blinding him in a slow circle as he took comfort in a picture that made him wonder. But no matter how fast they ran, they could never seem to gain any ground. The whispers followed them, growing louder, closer. The shadows in the trees flickered like moving shapes, stretching and contorting. A flash of something, or someone, caught the corner of Lena's eye, and for a split second she saw the faint outline of a figure, pale and twisted. Standing between the trees, her heart skipped a beat.
Did you see that?
She gasped. Marcus's voice cracked.
We're not alone.
Just then the whispering stopped. The mist parted for a moment, revealing a clearing ahead. But the sense of unease only deepened. The clearing was wrong. It wasn't natural. The air felt thicker here, as if it was pressing down on them from every side.
But keep moving.
Ethan urged again, his voice strained with fear.
We're not stopping here.
But they didn't need to stop. The path ahead was blocked, as if the forest itself had decided that they would go no further. A shadow flickered on the edge of their vision. Something was in the mist. Something was waiting for them. As the sun dipped below the mountains, the once vibrant landscape was swallowed by an unnatural darkness. The trio reached a small, secluded clearing, perfect for setting up camp. Lena, Ethan, and Marcus worked quickly, unloading their backpacks and laying out the gear. The fire flickered and crackled, its warm glow contrasting with the cold creeping into the forest. But even the fire's warmth couldn't chase away the unease that gripped each of them. Lena sat on a nearby rock, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted her jacket. The air felt thicker than it should have, heavier. The forest around them was too quiet, the trees standing motionless, their branches like twisted fingers. It was as if the world had frozen in place, suspended in a moment of dread.
We should have set up higher up the ridge.
Marcus said, glancing over his shoulder at the dense fog rolling in from the valley below. His voice sounded strained.
It's already creeping in.
Ethan waved him off.
We're fine. The fog's normal, nothing to worry about.
But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt that Lena caught. She didn't want to admit it, But she, too, felt the pull of fear, like a thread tugging at her from deep within the forest. As night fell, the fog thickened, curling around their camp like a living thing. The fire crackled and popped, its orange glow barely reaching past the first few rows of trees. The wind, which had been still all day, seemed to pick up, but it didn't bring sound, just the faintest swish of leaves moving in unnatural patterns. Lena pulled her knees up to her chest, staring into the fire.
Do you ever get the feeling something's watching us?
She whispered. Marcus was staring into the darkened woods, eyes narrowing.
Yeah. I'm like someone standing just outside the light, waiting for the right moment.
He forced a smile.
It's just Palmine's playing tricks.
But Lena wasn't convinced. The air was oppressive, the silence too thick to ignore. She could feel her pulse quicken with every minute that passed. The fire, once their comfort, now felt distant, like a candle flickering in a vast, empty room. Ethan reached for the GPS device.
Let's get some bearings,
He said, trying to break the tension. The screen blinked to life, but when he looked down at the map, his face went pale.
This doesn't make sense.
He muttered.
According to this, we're off course. We should be back on the main trail by now.
Lena shot up.
What do you mean? We've been following the map.
Ethan shook his head.
We're still miles from the junction.
Maybe it's malfunction.
Marcus suggested, though his voice wavered. But even as he spoke, a knot of dread tightened in Lena's stomach. The forest felt different. There was an unnatural weight to it, as if it had been there for centuries, watching them. The silence deepened, suffocating. The crack of a twig underfoot seemed impossibly loud, each sound echoing in the stillness. The fog closed in tighter, brushing against Lena's skin, cool and unnatural. Then, from the corner of her eye, Lena saw something move, a shadow in the trees, just beyond the firelight. It was quick, fleeting, but unmistakable. Something was out there.
Did you see that?
She whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus and Ethan turned, but the forest was still, only the fog moved.
Probably just an animal.
Ethan said, too calmly.
Baby, a deer.
But Lena wasn't convinced. The whisper of wind carried with it a faint murmur, too subtle to make out at first. Then again, it came, louder. Lena. Her heart stopped.
Did you hear that?
Lena's voice trembled.
Hear what?
Marcus asked, scanning the trees.
Oh, there's nothing out there.
But Lena wasn't sure. The whisper had been real, coming from just beyond the light. The air felt heavy, charged, as though something unseen was waiting for them to lower their guard. Ethan chuckled nervously, but there was no humor in it.
It's just the wind.
He said, but his voice betrayed him. His hand trembled as he reached for the map again, eyes darting nervously through the trees. The fire flickered, casting long, warped shadows as the fog thickened. A cold gust of wind swept through the clearing, causing the fire to sputter and smoke. For a moment, it felt like something terrible was on the edge of breaking through, and then, from the darkness, came another whisper. Lena? Her name again, but this time, it wasn't the wind. It was a human voice. Low, echoing. But there was no one there. The clock struck midnight, and the air grew colder still. The fire's glow flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced and warped in the mist. The fog had become so thick that it swallowed the trees around them, the world beyond the campfire's light, completely obscured. Silence settled over the clearing, but this time, it wasn't the comforting kind of silence that came with the night. No, this was a silence that held something. Something waiting. Something watching. Lena's skin crawled. Her mind kept racing over the events of the evening. The strange feelings, the whispers that seemed to move with the wind. She glanced over at Ethan and Marcus, both of them sitting closer to the fire now, their eyes darting around nervously. The air was oppressive, like it was pressing in from all sides. Every rustle in the trees seemed too loud, every crack of a twig too deliberate. And then, breaking through the stillness, it came. A whisper, low, soft, almost indistinguishable from the wind at first, but as it persisted, it grew clearer, undeniable. Lena? Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't know if she had imagined it or if it was real, but there it was again, faint, yet unmistakable. Lena? She turned quickly to Marcus and Ethan.
Did you hear that?
She whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan shook his head, a nervous laugh escaping his lips.
It's just the wind. Nothing more.
But Lena wasn't convinced. Her heartbeat quickened as she strained her ears to listen. The whisper was real. It had to be. She could feel it, vibrating in her chest. And then, as if in response to her doubt, it came again, louder this time, clearer. It was followed by another voice, softer but equally distinct. Lena's stomach dropped. It was as if something was calling them, beckoning them, out into the mist. Her eyes widened, her pulse quickening.
It's calling us,
she said, voice barely above a whisper. Marcus stood up abruptly, his eyes searching the dark void beyond the campfire.
I'll check it out,
He said, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty.
No.
Lena protested, fear gripping her chest.
Marcus, don't go. It's not safe.
But Marcus was already stepping forward, moving toward the thick fog. He glanced over his shoulder, offering a half smile. I'll be fine. Stay here. Keep the fire going. The mist swallowed him whole, and just like that, he was gone. The clearing fell into an even deeper silence. The fire's crackles the only sound that dared break the oppressive stillness. Lena's eyes stayed glued to the fog, watching the swirling mist where Marcus had disappeared. It felt wrong, so wrong, like they were playing into something they didn't understand. Ethan stood up now, pacing nervously.
This is a bad idea. He shouldn't have gone out there alone.
Lena shook her head, her fear escalating.
Shouldn't have gone at all. We need to leave now.
But just as the words left her lips, the whispering began again, this time more urgent, more insistent. Marcus. It was his name, unmistakably, carried on the wind. Lena's heart slammed against her ribs. The voice was growing more frantic, like it was calling to him, drawing him deeper into the forest, deeper into something they didn't understand. Lena, Ethan. The whispers called again, this time the voices almost overlapping, echoing through the fog. Lena could feel the hair on the back of her neck stand up, her eyes darting back and forth between the mist and Ethan's terrified face.
It's not coming back.
she said, her voice breaking as the realization hit her. Ethan grabbed her arm, his grip tight.
And we need to get out of here now, before it's too late.
But the fog was closing in, wrapping itself tighter around their camp, swallowing the light. It felt like the forest itself was alive, like it had become something else. Something ancient. Something angry. The whispering voices, now joined by the soft rustling of something unseen moving just beyond the mist, filled the air. And then, as Lena glanced into the fog once more, she saw it. A shape. Moving, but not quite right. It was too tall, too slender, its outline obscured by the swirling mist. She froze, her blood running cold. It was moving closer, toward them, but Marcus was nowhere to be seen.
Marcus!
She called out, her voice cracking.
Where are you?
There was no answer, only the whispers. Louder now, the voices had merged into a maddening chorus, each one indistinguishable from the other, echoing in every direction. It was as if the forest itself had come alive with them. Lena turned to Ethan, her face pale with terror.
We need to leave. We need to get out of here.
But as she spoke, the fog closed in completely, the fire's light barely a flicker in the sea of mist. The world around them was swallowed whole, and all that was left was the deafening silence and the whispers. And somewhere, in the distance, Marcus's voice joined the chorus. But it was different now. It was faint, barely a whisper, and it was calling their names. Lena and Ethan sat in stunned silence, the weight of the night pressing down on them. The fire, once a warm beacon in the darkness, now seemed weak and distant, its crackles faint against the oppressive quiet of the fog. Hours had passed since Marcus vanished into the mist, and in that time, the forest had grown even more suffocating. The whispers had faded for a moment, but now they were back. Faint at first, like the fluttering of a distant bird's wings, but then growing louder, more insistent. Lena. The whisper floated through the mist like a ghost. The voice was unmistakable, but it wasn't Marcus's. It wasn't even a single voice anymore. It was a chorus, low and reverberating, a chorus that seemed to come from the very trees themselves. Lena, Ethan. Lena's heart raced as the whispers circled them, their cold breath brushing against her skin. She turned to Ethan, her eyes wide with fear. His face was pale, his mouth set in a tight line. He was gripping the knife in his hand, the one they had kept for safety, but it didn't offer the comfort it once had. The fog had swallowed them whole, and the world had become a suffocating blur of white and gray.
Where is he?
Ethan whispered, voice shaking. Lena couldn't answer. Her thoughts were racing too fast, her chest tightening with panic. The fog felt alive, pressing in from all sides, and the whispers were growing more frantic, more urgent, as if they were calling for her, urging her to join them. Without warning, Lena stood up. The decision had already formed in her mind, though the weight of it made her stomach churn. Marcus was out there, lost in the fog, and they couldn't sit here waiting any longer. He needed them. Or at least that's what she told herself.
I'm going after him,
she said, her voice hoarse with fear. Ethan reached out, grabbing her wrist.
Lena, don't. We don't know what's out there. It's too dangerous. We're better off staying here, waiting for morning.
But Lena shook her head, her eyes fixed on the swirling mist beyond the campfire's dim light.
I have to. He's out there, and he's calling for us. You heard it too.
Before Ethan could protest further, Lena yanked her wrist free and took a step toward the fog. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears like a drum of war. She could feel the weight of the night pressing against her, the silence too thick, too heavy to bear. The whispers had grown louder, and now they were calling her name too. Her legs felt like lead, but her mind was set. She couldn't sit by any longer. She couldn't wait and wonder if Marcus was alive, if he needed help. She had to know.
Lena, please don't go.
Ethan shouted after her, but his voice was drowned out by the swirling mist. She didn't turn back. With each step she took into the fog, the world around her became more alien. The trees, once familiar, now loomed like monstrous shapes, twisted and contorted in ways that defied nature. The mist wrapped around her like a suffocating shroud, pressing in, blurring her vision. The firelight from behind her grew dimmer until it was nothing more than a faint glimmer, swallowed whole by the fog. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. They seemed to rise from the very ground beneath her feet, like the earth itself was calling out to her. Lena's heart raced, and her breath came in shallow, frantic gasps. "Marcus!" she shouted, her voice weak in the unnatural stillness.
Marcus, where are you?
Her words were swallowed by the fog, the silence returning with an eerie finality. She didn't know where she was anymore. She didn't know how far she had walked, or how deep into the woods she had gone. It was as if the fog had no end, no beginning. She was lost in a labyrinth of mist and shadows. Suddenly, there was a rustling in the trees, a faint movement, like something, or someone, brushing through the fog. Her heart skipped a beat. "Marcus?" she called again, her voice cracking, but there was no answer. The air around her felt wrong, too heavy, as if something ancient and unnatural was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She could feel it, the cold, the pressure, the malevolent presence lurking just beyond the veil of mist. Her skin crawled, and every instinct screamed for her to turn back, but she couldn't. She couldn't leave without knowing what had happened to Marcus. The rustling grew louder, closer. Lena's breath caught in her throat, and her pulse quickened. She was no longer alone. Out of the corner of her eye, something moved. A shadow, tall and twisted, slipping through the fog like a wraith. It was just a blur at first, but then it became clearer. A figure, humanoid in shape, but wrong. Too tall. Too thin. Its outline obscured by the fog. It stopped, just beyond her reach, watching her with eyes she couldn't see. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her now. "Lena, come closer." Lena's heart pounded in her chest. Every part of her wanted to run, to get out of there, but her legs were frozen in place. She knew, deep down, that if she stepped closer, if she gave in to the whispers, it would be the last decision she ever made. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, swallowed back into the mist. Lena's legs gave way and she collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was now worse than any sound. Her only thought now was to find Marcus, and pray that whatever was in the mist hadn't found him first. Lena's breath came in short, frantic bursts as she pressed deeper into the fog, each step sending ripples through the thick mist. The world around her was a ghostly blur, shapes and shadows moving just beyond her reach, mocking her desperation. The air was freezing, a chill that sank deep into her bones, as if the forest itself was alive and watching her every move. She couldn't stop now. She couldn't go back without knowing what had happened to Marcus. The whispers still echoed in her mind. Too real to ignore. Her name. The strange, unsettling sound of Marcus calling her from the mist, though she knew deep down that it wasn't him. Not anymore. A flicker in the distance caught her eye. At first, she thought it was a trick of the fog, another shadow that would fade when she drew closer. But then it became clearer, more defined, and her heart skipped a beat. A figure stood ahead on the path, tall, pale, and twisted. It was motionless, as though frozen in time. The figure's limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally, like a grotesque parody of a human form. Its body was pale, almost sickly in color, and it stood at an impossible angle, as though it had been bent into place, rather than having taken that stance naturally. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to call out, to scream for Marcus, to ask if it was him, but she couldn't. Her throat was dry, her words choked by fear. She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. Could it be Marcus? Could he have somehow changed? Or had something else taken him? Something terrible? Something unnatural? She tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in her stomach, that instinct telling her to run, to turn and never look back. But something else tugged at her, something stronger, a strange force she couldn't name. She took a hesitant step forward, then another. The figure remained unmoving, but its presence felt like an inescapable pull, like the gravity of a black hole drawing her closer. As she drew nearer, the figure's face came into focus, but it wasn't Marcus, it was something else. Something worse. The face was obscured, wrapped in shadows. But its eyes, those eyes glowed faintly, an unnatural, eerie light that pierced the darkness. They were the color of dying embers, burning cold and hollow, and they seemed to stare directly into her soul, pulling at her heart with a strange and terrible magnetism. The figure raised one long, twisted hand. The gesture was slow, deliberate, but the movement itself felt wrong, as though the arm was too long, the joints too sharp. It reached toward her, and Lena froze. A tremor ran through her as the figure beckoned her forward. The motion was so fluid, so unnatural, that it was like a command, a silent invitation. Her body wanted to move, but her mind screamed for her to run. The coldness of the mist seemed to press in from all sides, closing in around her, suffocating her. But she couldn't. Not anymore. She was already too close, her feet moving almost of their own accord, as though drawn by some unseen force. The air grew heavier with each step. The fog seemed to close in tighter, the trees warping, bending, as if they too were alive, complicit in the creature's beckoning. Lena! The voice echoed through the fog, soft and yet so familiar. It was her name, spoken in the same low whisper she had heard before. But this time, it wasn't the wind. It was a command, a call that seemed to come from the figure itself. Her heart pounded in her chest, her legs trembling with fear, yet she couldn't stop herself from taking another step forward. The figure's eyes never left hers, never blinked. They glowed brighter now, as if responding to her fear. They burned with a hollow emptiness, as though whatever was inside them had long since been consumed. Lena could feel it, that same dread, the realization that whatever she was seeing was not of this world. Her foot moved again, another step closer. She was almost within reach of the figure now. She could feel its presence like a shadow looming over her, a dark weight pressing in on her chest. Her body trembled, but her feet wouldn't stop. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, louder than ever, drowning out the whispers, the fog, the world around her. She was nearly there. And then, just as she reached out, her hand trembling, the figure's mouth opened. No sound came at first, but then, as if it had been waiting for her to get this close, the voice whispered in her ear. Chilling, hollow, almost melodic.
You shouldn't have come.
The word sent a wave of cold dread crashing over Lena. Her body froze. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't think. It was as though the world had stopped, and she was suspended in that one terrifying moment, hanging between terror and disbelief. The figure raised its hand again, and this time it wasn't beckoning her. It was reaching for her, its fingers stretching out impossibly long like claws, toward her face, toward her throat. Lena stumbled back, her mind screaming for her to run. But the fear had frozen her in place, her legs shaking beneath her, her feet rooted to the earth. The air around her seemed to freeze, too, the mist hanging in the air, thick and suffocating, pressing against her skin, squeezing the breath from her lungs. She couldn't move, couldn't escape. She was trapped in its gaze, lost in the glow of its eyes as the darkness closed in around her. Lena's heart raced, her breath shallow as she moved closer to the figure, drawn in by a force stronger than her fear, Every step she took toward it felt like a battle. Her instinct screamed for her to turn back, to escape. But her body moved on its own, as though the very air around her had wrapped itself around her, pulling her closer. But just as she reached out, a figure, that twisted, pale silhouette, vanished into the mist, disappearing as if it had never been there. Lena stopped dead in her tracks, her hands still trembling in the cold air, her pulse pounding in her ears. She blinked rapidly, her eyes scanning the fog for any trace of it, but there was nothing. Just emptiness. The fog around her seemed to close in, thickening, swirling. It pressed down on her, suffocating, leaving her dizzy, disoriented. She spun around, trying to retrace her steps, but the path seemed to stretch on forever, winding in impossible directions, twisting like a labyrinth. Every direction she turned felt wrong, like she was walking in circles. The whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. She could hear them, low and insistent, like an echo in the back of her mind. Her name. Lena. The sound wrapped itself around her, pulling her deeper into the fog, tugging at her thoughts, clouding her mind. It was as if the forest itself was calling her, demanding her attention. She tried to shout, to call out for Marcus, for Ethan, but her voice caught in her throat. Every sound she made seemed to disappear into the mist, swallowed up by the oppressive silence that followed. The fog felt alive, pulsating, shifting, and with each step she took, the fear that had gripped her heart grew stronger, more suffocating. Then, in the distance, something moved. It was a figure. At first, she thought it was Marcus, returning to her. But as the shape came into view, her stomach twisted into a knot. It was him, but it wasn't. Marcus was there, standing in the fog, his face pale, his eyes wide and unblinking, his body swayed unnaturally, like a puppet whose strings were pulled by invisible hands. His limbs jerked in odd twitching motions, and his gaze, empty, hollow, never wavered from her. Something was wrong. Lena's breath hitched as her heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to run to him, to reach out, but she could feel the pull of the mist tightening around her, slowing her steps. Her legs felt heavy, as though the very earth beneath her was trying to keep her in place. She wanted to call out to him, to tell him to snap out of whatever this was, but the words wouldn't come. And then, standing beside Marcus, Lena saw another figure, taller, darker, its shape indistinct, like a shadow in the fog. It loomed over him, watching her with eyes that gleamed, with a sickening hunger. Fear surged through Lena like an electric shock, paralyzing her. Her body trembled with the weight of the moment, her mind screaming for her to turn and run, but she couldn't move. She couldn't look away. She was trapped in the fog, trapped in the darkness that was closing in around her.
Marcus.
She managed to croak, her voice barely audible, but as soon as the words left her lips, the ground beneath her feet trembled. The earth seemed to shift beneath her, a low, rumbling sound rising from the depths. Before she could react, the ground cracked wide open. Lena gasped, her heart racing, and she scrambled to steady herself, but it was too late. The ground gave way beneath her. She fell, the world spinning around her, her body tumbling through the air as the darkness swallowed her whole. The fog seemed to reach up toward her, its icy fingers dragging her deeper into the abyss. She couldn't scream. The fall was too fast, too sudden, and the darkness wrapped around her, suffocating her, as if the very air had turned to lead. She felt weightless, falling with no end in sight, the world gone in an instant. And then, a voice. A whisper, so faint she could barely hear it. Lena! It called her name again. The sound was soft, like a caress, but it was wrong. It was cold, empty, filled with the same eerie, unnatural force she had felt since entering the forest. Her mind spun, her body frozen, and then the ground below her disappeared entirely. The blackness was all-consuming. There was no light, no sound, nothing. Just the cold, the silence, and the weight of something ancient pressing down on her. Lena's eyes fluttered open, a sharp pain rushing to meet her as her mind fought to make sense of the world around her. Her head throbbed, and for a moment she lay there, disoriented, unsure of where she was. The air felt different now, colder, cleaner, yet there was a thick sense of emptiness that surrounded her, like something was missing, something important. As she slowly pushed herself up, the fog, the heavy, suffocating fog that had trapped her moments before, was gone. The mountain stood still and silent, bathed in an eerie quiet that seemed unnatural, as if the very landscape was holding its breath. Lena took a shallow breath, her lungs aching as she sat up, scanning the area. The trail was gone. There were no signs of her friends. No Marcus, no Ethan. Just the trees, the stillness, and the vast expanse of wilderness stretching out before her. It was like the world had reset, erasing everything she knew, leaving only an unsettling calm. The world around her felt hollow, as if she was standing on the edge of reality itself, peering into an abyss. Her body trembled, not from the cold, but from the growing sense of dread that gnawed at her insides. She called out, her voice weak and ragged, but the sound seemed to vanish before it could even reach the trees.
Marcus, Ethan.
Her words felt like a desperate echo, swallowed by the vast emptiness. But there was no reply, only the wind, soft and disinterested, brushing against the trees. The world seemed frozen in time, yet everything felt wrong. The air was still, too still. And Lena's pulse quickened with the growing realization that she was utterly alone. No trail to follow, no way to track where she had fallen, and no trace of her friends. The ground beneath her felt strange, as if it had changed shape while she was unconscious. The path she had followed was gone, as though it had never existed. She glanced around, trying to piece together where she was, but everything felt alien. The trees too dark, the rocks too jagged, the earth too soft beneath her feet. She took a step forward, only to freeze when she noticed something out of place. A small, twisted branch lay on the ground, half buried in the dirt, its shape unnervingly familiar. Her breath caught in her throat as she bent down, her fingers trembling as she touched it. The way the wood was snapped, the way the leaves still clung to it, it was from the forest she had been in, the same place where Marcus had begun. The same place where everything had begun to spiral into madness. Her mind raced as memories flooded back, Marcus disappearing into the mist, the distorted figure that had beckoned her, the way the ground had split open beneath her. The whispers, the voices that called her name. Lena's hands gripped the branch, her knuckles white as the weight of it all pressed down on her. She had to find them. She couldn't just leave them here, not like this. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how impossible that seemed. It was as if the very mountain itself was conspiring against her, erasing all traces of the trail, leaving no way forward or back. With a heavy heart, Lena stood up, her mind racing, trying to think of a way out, a way to understand what had happened. The world felt off-kilter, like a puzzle with missing pieces, and she was the only one left to solve it. She glanced at the trees again, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers, beckoning her into the unknown. Something was out there, something waiting. The presence that had stalked them, the one that had haunted the trail, was still here. She could feel it, watching her, lingering just beyond her vision. It was as if the mountain itself was alive, breathing, waiting for the next soul to wander too far. Her breath caught in her throat as the whispers returned. Soft at first, barely more than a breeze in the trees, but then louder, clearer. They called her name again. Lena Her pulse quickened and her body tensed, frozen in place. The voice was familiar, but wrong. Not like Marcus, not like Ethan. This voice had a coldness to it, a hollow ring, as if it was speaking from somewhere deep within the earth. Her heart hammered in her chest, and for a moment she was paralyzed with fear. She had to move, had to get away from the sound, from whatever it was, but her legs refused to obey. She stood there, helpless, staring into the dense trees, trying to make sense of what was happening, trying to keep her mind from spiraling into panic. The whisper came again, louder, and with it the feeling that something was creeping closer. The air seemed to grow thicker, the world around her distorting, and she could feel a weight pressing down on her chest, choking her. Her eyes darted around, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw movement in the corner of her vision. A shadow, shifting among the trees, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. Nothing but the vast emptiness and the weight of the unknown. Lena felt herself being drawn toward the whisper. It wasn't her choice. She wasn't walking anymore. Her feet were moving on their own, as if the mountain itself had a grip on her, pulling her deeper into the woods. Each step felt like it took her further away from reality, further into the grip of something ancient and malicious. The presence was waiting, and Lena was about to find out just how far it would go to claim her next. Lena's footsteps faltered, her body moving through the fog as though controlled by some unseen force. The whispers, soft but growing louder, twisted through her mind. The coldness around her deepened, suffocating, until it felt like the air itself was made of shadows. The trees closed in, their branches now tangled and gnarled, clawing at the sky, blocking out what little light the moon had to offer. The trail, if it had ever truly existed, was lost to her now, as if swallowed by the mountain itself. The silence between the whispers was deafening, a vacuum that seemed to drain her every sense. And then she saw it. At first it was just a shape in the distance, barely visible through the mist, but as she drew closer, her heart stopped. There, standing in front of her, was a figure. She recognized him instantly. Marcus. But this was not the same Marcus she had known. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring into nothingness. His body was stiff, unnatural, as if frozen in time. Lena's throat tightened as she called his name, but her voice barely broke the silence.
Marcus? Marcus, it's me. Are you...
She took a step closer, but Marcus didn't respond. His head tilted slightly to one side, a faint, eerie smile curling at the corners of his mouth. And then he spoke, his voice hollow and distant, as if it came from the very earth beneath her feet.
You shouldn't have come here, Lena.
The words hit her like a physical blow. The whispering grew louder, and for the first time, she realized that the voice, Marcus's voice, wasn't coming from him at all. It was coming from everywhere, from the trees, from the ground, from the very air around her. It was the mountain itself, speaking through him. Lena's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She tried to step back, but something gripped her, pulling her closer to Marcus, to the thing that now wore his face. Her mind screamed for her to run, to escape. But she couldn't move. Her legs were frozen, her body paralyzed by the cold touch of the mountain's grasp. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and she felt herself sinking, slowly, painfully, into the earth. The fog thickened around her, obscuring everything except the pale figure of Marcus. And then, in a rush of terror, Lena understood. The lost path was not just a trail, it was a prison, a place where those who ventured too far were lost, consumed by something ancient, something hungry. And now, it was her turn.
Please, no,
she whispered, her voice cracking. But there was no escape. The mountain was hungry and it always fed. Lena's eyes filled with tears, her chest tightening as she was drawn further into the fog. The last thing she saw was Marcus, his twisted smile growing wider, before everything went dark. The next morning, the forest stood silent once again. The trail remained as it always had, a faint, winding path that led nowhere. The mist had lifted, and the sun shone brightly through the trees, but it was as if nothing had happened. No sign of Lena, no trace of Marcus or Ethan. The lost path had claimed another, and somewhere deep within the mountains, the whispers waited, waiting for the next wanderer to hear them.